Okay, so at this time, we are going to make a transition. And as a part of that, I want to say thank you to all the people who prepared their lightning talks in advance. That went smoothly. It didn't have to go smoothly, but I appreciate having all those files in advance. And I think it allowed us to hear a lot of rich perspectives in a short amount of time. And as our invited speakers come up for the panel discussion, which I would like to invite them now to come on up for that purpose, I wanted to remind everyone that the beginnings of that panel is an opportunity for the invited speakers to comment on things that they saw in those lightning talks. But I need to get myself set up on Zoom here, so I'm just going to pause one moment to do that. So let me just highlight our procedure here, which is, as before, for any questions that you have, you may ask them verbally at the microphone, or virtually. You can either be asked we'll ask you to unmute if you raise your hand, and if you want to do it virtually, I will monitor the chat to make sure that I can also ask those questions as well directly. Let me also highlight, I think everybody who's on Zoom can see that Jen Wojcik is with us, who, even though she's not here in person, is with us virtually for this panel as well. And so people may want to ask her a question directly about her presentation earlier. So let's now then give everyone an opportunity to comment on the lightning talks, and not everyone, not everything, but maybe just one or two things that jumped out to you during those recordings. So the floor is open to the panel for that purpose, please.
I was really excited to hear about this mentoring program in the first lightning talk. I am always surprised looking back at how little I understood about the process of research and even the process of getting a PhD when I signed up to do that. And it's been really important to me as I move along in my career to try to keep those doors open behind me. So that sounds like something I would really like to be involved in, and that something I really missed when I was an undergraduate. I didn't feel like I could actually find a way to be a part of research projects at that stage in my career. And it's been really rewarding to work with undergraduates as a postdoc. And just something that was highlighted in those slides was enhancing a sense of belonging. And I think this is another thing that we tend to overlook when we talk about diversity and membership in groups, is that there's very much a dimension of a sense of well-being and recognition and acceptance that we can associate with these categories, but which we often abstract away from. And so to see people really engaged and centering that notion that we need to have a community where people actually feel like they belong. It's often put out as a sort of a lip service, but I really appreciated that and the initiative that was described in that talk. So
I can chime in next. That also really stood out to me too. What an awesome program. Earlier today, I had the chance to talk a little bit about centering racial equity across the data lifecycle. And I just made a few notes about things that I noticed from across the presentations about how this happens in real life and great examples of doing that. And I thought that, Sharon talked a lot about improving data collection practices around race and ethnicity data. And this is a thing that we often talk about, the folks that I work with, a lot of state and local agencies. There's a lot of focus on like generating algorithms and producing these like really sexy models to predict things, but simple stuff like making sure your data is high quality, particularly your data around race and ethnicity, if you want to be able to analyze and understand experiences, or figuring out how to move beyond collecting just male, female in gender and sex boxes. So I thought that was a great example of just the importance of collecting data really influences what happens downstream. And then in the analysis phase of working with data, it was Vanessa and Victoria that showed this really great historical timeline of the COVID-19 pandemic and other historical contextual factors that were happening while they were doing different waves of their survey. They mentioned a responsive and flexible survey design, which I thought was really great. To oftentimes we think of research as being kind of rigid, but being flexible to the historical moment and to the context is important. And I think that timeline thing is a relatively simple thing that any analytic project that's looking across time, like, I think a lot about policy analysis, and that is very much, there's so much context in terms of like other policies and programs and historical events that are going on for people, and just laying that out there is a great next step towards thinking about equity in that phase of the data life cycle.
Just to build, so I want to build off what Sharon was just saying. I also thought, I already know a lot about this project. I know Vanessa and Victoria less. But it's, the standard, usually there's two approaches in longitudinal research. Either you're rigid across waves and you're always collecting the exact same information, even if that information is not particularly good, right? So you continue to use a scale that has problems because you want to maintain the measurement across waves, right? So it's either extremely rigid or it's totally haphazard by who happens to be working on the project at that time. Personnel come and go, there's different PIs and co-PIs, things kind of get taken out and put back in. And so I think their approach is really refreshing about this more responsive kind of contextual approach to doing longitudinal designs, which I don't think I've ever really seen anything like that before. And I think it's a nice new model that a lot of us could learn a lot from.
I'll just pile on that. I think there's this like interplay between replicability or reproducibility and iteration, where you learn new things so in my work, when I do analysis of performance of state agencies, I learn from all the things that I've messed up and tried to redo. And then I figure out ways, and I've developed with partners actually at the U of M, ways to test new ways to improve what I've been working on. And I think that reproducibility helps you learn how to do things better. And that iteration is kind of key. And that's what I really liked about both the emotional wellness survey and the interaction analysis. I thought that kind of iterative process in the analyses is really, really cool.
So Jen, did you have some thoughts you'd like to share with us on the lightning talks?
Yeah, I think folks have already shared a lot of the thoughts I already had on this.
Why can't we hear Jen? Hold on just a second, Jen.
No
we
problem.
Need to get your audio. Okay, now try.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
We
great.
can hear you now.
Yeah, so I think, folks have already said a lot of things that I was going to touch upon, but one thing that really struck me is that, a lot of time with research, we see, okay, there's a problem over there that needs to be addressed. Let's, try to address that problem. But instead, what we're seeing here is what can happen when we allow ourselves to look, okay, what are we doing? What is the problem with what we're doing and with the process, without our own processes, and looking internally, I think, and having the freedom and the flexibility to address those problems without constraining them, given on past histories, the way things have previously been done. Whether that's how we mentor, the next generation of folks who are coming up, spotting the problems in the actual frameworks we have. And I think it's just really great to see all that because, there's been resistance in the past for this sort of inward looking and this flexible kind of research. But it's equally as important as like the reproducibility, the rigor and everything.
Great, thanks. So let me start some broad reflections on the day through a theme that seemed to bubble up for me from a number of the presentations, which was transparency. And it was not necessarily transparency in the same way in each case, but it seemed like bringing things to the surface was an important dimension in a lot of the talks. And I think that I was struck by the fact that because we had such diverse areas of inquiry represented, that theme was there. So I wonder if I can invite the panelists to speak a little bit about that theme of transparency, both potentially elaborating on some of the things that you said earlier, but also maybe the ways you see some of the connections with the other presentations today.
I can say a few things about that. I totally agree with that, Alan. Absolutely. And I don't think it's any surprise, really, that that's the case. I think we know quite well that people and scholars from marginalized backgrounds or who are doing work with marginalized groups, one of the things that they're particularly good at is making the invisible become more visible, right? It's pointing out those things that are like the defaults for most people, for the mainstream, saying, you know what, this isn't default for everybody. This is only default for you. And so it really is about trying to surface those assumptions, those beliefs, those, you know, the hidden biases. I think the Harvard or HI sentence task is a great example of that, of just sort of, it's this gold standard. And it just has sort of perpetuated itself until someone comes along and actually says, what the heck are we doing here, right? And it takes that perspective to be able to call out those questions about our practices. So I think that's one of the hallmarks of kind of the marginalized perspective, really, is being able to name and identify these kinds of things.
I think when we talk about transparency and visibility, that we really need to distinguish between kinds of invisibility, because the invisibility that you get from active exclusion is not the same as the invisibility that you get from passive uncritical inclusion. And I think a lot in my work about how we perceive social categories in terms of this really strong distinction between social categories that we essentially expect and value, and those which we are more avoidant of. And those which are invisibilized for different reasons. And I think that there's a tendency to kind of conflate this process of like which groups are actually considered visible, when the processes which actually say make white English speaking people relatively invisible in speech science are actually functioning to make them highly visible. It's just that the way that we talk about it is, it's like they're visibilized through the research, but invisibilized through the discourse, the way that we talk about the research. And contrastively, groups which are typically normatively invisible, people of color, marginalized sexualities, et cetera, that when they are made the focus of studies, they aren't just made visible, they're made hyper visible. And a lot of people talked about how the standards for publishing research, once you indicate that any of these normatively invisible groups are actually interesting or of focus, that often the pushback is that, well, clearly you should also include these more mainstream, like that by treating certain social groups as weird groups, which are just very underdetermined, very ill-defined. And so I'm really interested in how we can tease apart these different processes of visibility and invisibility, because they really do function very differently.
I can kind of keep building on that notion, and something that comes to mind for me as someone who thinks in terms of data, I think most about administrative data that's collected by human service systems. And we know inherently that there is bias baked into that data. The communities of color in particular are overrepresented and over-surveilled by many government programs. So this theme of transparency is obviously really important in government land, because on one hand, we want transparent systems. On the other hand, governments do have these data that are very sensitive that people shouldn't have transparent access to. But I think there's a risk of hiding behind like rules and regulations and saying like, well, we can't share data because we're just not allowed to. And I think that's you can be transparent without sharing individual level identifiable data with people. Another thread I'll pull on here is that, we've talked a little bit today about the importance of like understanding nuance and variation in different social groups' experiences with whatever social problem or phenomena we're talking about. And in human service work in general, we have to like kind of hold these two competing things at the same time when we're thinking about disaggregating data. On the one hand, we want to disaggregate data to better understand people's experiences and how they might be different from the default or from the typical track. And then on the other hand, going back to this idea of over surveillance for communities of color, groups that have been historically marginalized by government systems, when you disaggregate data in the wrong context with the wrong purpose or the wrong intentions in mind, you can do more harm. And that is a big challenge for government, is like when to really lean into transparency, and maybe when transparency could actually be more harmful to people, and what that right balance is. There's no good answer to it.
No, there isn't any good answer. So I was sort of reflecting on like how misrepresented the participants who come to the state for cash and food assistance are. I think if you're old enough, maybe you're not, like it's a bad rap that folks get who come on public assistance, but they represent such a huge diversity of experiences. And I think that's like a piece of transparency that I hope that we can share more, is the huge diversity of experiences that low-income people in Minnesota experience, and how they come and utilize the programs that the state provides, but also share kind of the what's administrative burdens that we place on these families. So it's interesting he's talking about monitoring and like monitoring communities of color, and I see in my work, well, the economy discriminates against people of color. And so I see a lot of participants are overrepresented in that group, in those groups, but it's partially a reflection of the economy, but also that means we're monitoring them and requiring people to fill out paperwork and all these things to get access to these programs. But at the same time, if I could share more about what the different experiences of people, you'd really see overall what huge hardworking these people really like out. I'm always so distressed by the public image of what people do who are on public assistance. It's completely wrong from the people who I see in our programs. So I wish that transparency could come out more.
Jen, any thoughts from you on transparency?
Yeah, I mean, I can build off of two different points I already brought up. I mean, the first one is sort of the invisible versus visible parts of it. And there is the genetics community in general, and the research community is getting slightly better with this, but not great in that, because of the default being European ancestry populations, it's considered somewhat niche to work in non-European ancestry populations, which is absolutely ridiculous, but it's a thing. And so, only a couple years ago, maybe we'd submit these workshops at these major conferences, huge conferences with like 12,000 people, massive conferences. And they'd say, oh no, we already have a session on diversity. We already have a session on non-European populations. So we're all filled up. And you're like, well, okay, that's ridiculous. And then, on top of that, compounding it, there is that default. So if you publish a large study of the genetics of depression, it's most likely a study of completely, white participants. Then you publish a study of depression in Hispanic Latino communities. And therefore, that's how you get it published. That's like your secondary study, right? In this other group. And there's this, I think, a lack of nuance and a lack of education, or really thinking thoroughly about this within the genetics community, in that you really risk conflating biology with social constructs and race. And so this dichotomy of visibility and invisibility, for that, it complicates things as well, because people are misinterpreting that visibility or invisibility. And so that's sort of another thing to think about on our end. And I think folks are getting more intentional about this and more visible about this, but it's still a point of contention. And then on the transparency side of things, in terms of privacy and risk, there is a big open data movement in genomics research where all individual level data should be shared. The only way we're going to reach sort of, equality or maybe even equity in terms of how we do in this work is if we share everything. And there is a historical lack of acknowledgement that not everybody has the same risks when they're sharing their DNA, when it's being made public or within even some systems, especially when you're putting them in a government database. It is not the same risk, it is not the same considerations, and having a blanket term of saying everything has to be open access, everything has to be transparent of individual level data, actually harms the efforts in ways I think people don't fully understand the impact of. And so there needs to be, I think that the thing about genetics research is that we often come from a very, maybe more of a bench science aspect of things, very computational. A lot of us are computer scientists or, the computational folks in terms of that things. And so there's not a lot of knowledge about the social part of it, but it's necessary. And there needs to be this integration in a way that's nuanced and not blanket statements about everything needing to be fully transparent, because the harms are real. And just because the majority of folks who are doing the research don't understand those harms either intellectually or viscerally or from different experiences doesn't mean they're any less valid. And that's sort of important for us to consider moving forward.
Great, thank you to everyone. Great perspective on transparency. Not to be too literary, but another thing that emerged today in my mind was a phrase: it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, because arguably we have heard some great things happening, things that really should have happened a long time ago and are finally coming to fruition or getting started. But we also heard a lot of the sort of continuing difficulties and problems that are faced in different domains that people work in. So what I would like to invite the panelists to say something about is their one key discouragement about the contemporary landscape, the thing that stands out to you as the most frustrating, the most recalcitrant or difficult that you have to deal with, specifically in the areas you work on. But then, since we don't want to be too depressing, flip it and tell us what you think is the most positive thing that makes you excited, gets you out of bed in the morning, and makes you want to keep doing the work you're doing.
I don't have to go first again. So I will, but somebody else can go first.
Whoever wants to go is fine.
I said, go for it.
Okay, I can start. Yeah, I have answers to this, so I can go. So I think I gave a 35-minute talk about what discourages me, but more broadly, I think one of the most discouraging sort of general activities within psychological research and related fields is sort of the gravitation towards mindless heuristics, right? Simplistic ways of thinking about how to do our science. And that's been discussed heavily in the context of null hypothesis significance testing, right? You want to be able to just know, okay, if I get my p-value below 0.05, then I have a real effect, right? And that's being replaced with other kinds of benchmarks and heuristics. And that's exactly what you see in the study of culture and diversity as well. Again, with individualism and collectivism, let's boil down all global variation in psychological tendencies to two fundamental orientations, right? Or with weird, which becomes weird cultures and non-weird cultures. We really gravitate towards those simplistic explanations which is really disappointing to me that we continually do that. I mean, I think a lot of us are trying to get into the complexity of understanding what it is to be in this world. And we continue to we replace one simplistic heuristic with another, and we continue to go through that cycle. And I think that's kind of what discourages me quite a bit, that we do that in all areas. My point of hope, I'm supposed to be positive, right? Okay, encouragement, students, for sure, absolutely, students. Undergraduate students, graduate students, they see through all of this, right? They know that this is a problem. We were talking about this earlier. They see all these problems immediately. The problem is they get socialized into the system to believe these kinds of things that the more senior people believe. So we need to break that socialization cycle somehow. We need to put the students in charge maybe, and they should start socializing the researchers and the faculty. But I mean, they always give me hope. They're full of ideas. They understand, they see that in terms of transparency, they see the system how it is a little bit more clearly, or a lot more clearly, and have a more intuitive sense for what positive practices are. And so again, it's just because of the nature of academia and the need to sort of fit within the system and meet the standards of the system, it sort of reproduces the inequalities. And so hopefully, I think we're slowly working on trying to break that cycle, but that's what we need to do.
I'm going to try and avoid echoing all of that. But that pressure to just find a new heuristic, a new like easy peasy lemon squeezy, this is just follow these rules and then problem solve. That is really frustrating. And I also connect that very much with a certain sort of socio-emotional state. So it's always very frustrating to me when I go to describe some research finding, and I get really jazzed about the topics I study. And so it's exciting to me to say, okay, so look, they found this racial ethnic difference in how like 4 to 9-year-old children identify like match people with, and without getting into the finding, this is the sort of finding that I'll be excited about and I'll share. And then frequently, especially if I'm talking to a white researcher, there is a detour that takes place in the conversation there where they take time to make sure and impress upon me how regrettable they find the entire situation. They're like, oh, how sad it is that Black children learn earlier than white children things about code switching. And I'm like, but that's just part of our normal development. And I don't need you to emote at me about how horrible and sad it is that there's any racial differences at all, because I'm trying to get past this initial barrier of this is so uncomfortable to talk about, and this makes me feel guilty and worried and insecure, and like I have to scrabble for that heuristic, for that easy recipe of what can I do to just get past this discomfort, to get past my feelings of complicity, and just quickly move on. And that's the most frustrating thing, is trying to talk to people who are really well-meaning in their own minds, that they feel emotionally touched by the inequity and it bothers them, but they haven't figured out how to process that in a way that lets them really meaningfully engage with the science rather than foregrounding their emotional responses. And it's especially frustrating since, from my positionality as like my marginalized ethnicity, et cetera, I have to practice sort of like a hyper neutrality in the way that I present myself. And so to then be confronted constantly with white scientists crying to me about how upsetting racial disparities are is really bizarre. But I also am able to sort of connect that desire to just have a quick fix, come up with an heuristic, come up with a set of rules, and how it really maintains the invisibility of these systems. And if you are socialized as a dominant part of one of these systems, then it obviously makes you very uncomfortable to have it exposed, because you're not used to interacting with that view of yourself. If you're used to being racialized as white, and like you're not confronted constantly with what it means to be racialized. So when you suddenly are, it's a very difficult situation to be in. And like, I can't be everyone's therapist, but I feel that is the most frustrating thing, is feeling that I'm called on to do this sort of emotional handholding and reassurance for people who are insecure about their privilege, and that it gets in the way of just what I want to just get down to the nuts and bolts of, like, okay, but this is actually really interesting. So like, let's learn about it. And again, on the high note is that as frustrating as it feels to be trying to get empirical findings published that match intuitions I've had all along, like say, these HI sentences sound old and kind of unnatural. Like I've thought that the entire time I knew they existed. And I'm sure other people thought it too, but nobody actually published this finding. So it feels like a bit of a setback sometimes to be trudging through publishing these findings, but it does give me a lot of energy and hope to see the scholars coming up behind me who are going to be able to build on that scaffolding, and that gets me really excited. So I even, as frustrating as like that first part can be, I have a sense that I really am trailblazing, and I'm figuring out ways to navigate this that I can pass along to other people, and that's really encouraging.
I can go.
Go ahead.
I'll go. We're gonna cut the order real
Yeah.
quick. So I guess on the discouragement side, working in government's super weird. And one of the weird things is that like when I want to examine something, sometimes my boss says, look at the statute, like go to the law that was like passed, which is such a weird thing to do. Have you ever tried to read laws? They're super hard. And so in the programs that I work with in MFIP with cash assistance and SNAP, there's federal policy, federal laws, then the states implement their versions. Then the department that's in charge of that makes policies. They go down to somebody else who then implements those policies to their best of their abilities. And there's iteration between the department and them, and then it's acted upon individuals in the program. There's like endless places where disequity, inequities can be acted upon people or can have results on people within that process. And people are, I don't think they're necessarily protective of their programs, but people don't like to know that they've worked on something that is producing it. At least people I work with don't like to think that they've been working in programs that produce disequities. And so in my position as like a data research analyst person, when I'm elevating some of these findings, people sometimes will push back against that, because they don't want to understand their own role in it, which I get. Like, I don't like that about my job, that I see these disequities. And that happens at every single level. But the policy level, it's hard. Like, it's hard to get the state of Minnesota to change a law. It's hard to get the Department of Human Services to change a policy. It's hard to get local agencies to change their implementation of policies. So every single step is hard. So that's discouraging, I'll say. I guess the positive thing is that maybe it's just really close to my own group, but just having the space to conduct the analysis. Like, I think I'm still surprised every day in my job that as a state worker, I can create the space to do this kind of analysis, try to do good quantitative analysis using data from our programs to understand the population, help inform new policies, help understand implementation better. Like, the fact that there is space to do that, I think, is super important. And if there is any like state workers who do data analysis out there, like, create the time, and you'll be surprised at how much some random thing that you squeezed in a couple hours to work on will be like taken up the chain, because it's so uncommon for unique work to be done within departments and shared. So I think that's a positive thing.
I can circle back to this idea that the two of you were talking about, of people wanting to have simple heuristics to solve very complex problems. And in my world, the phrase that comes to mind for that. That's we often repeat between my colleagues is that you can't tech your way out of social problems. And in thinking about data infrastructure and data integration in human services, there's a lot of like outside like private industry and tech companies that are like, you know, chomping at the bit to build databases for people and get business to construct systems. And they're really selling a technical solution. But I would argue that like the tech is one small slice of this. And it is, you know, maybe even one of the simpler pieces of this. Relationships, politics, getting agencies to talk to each other across systems, working out governance processes. All of that is a huge chunk of sharing and integrating and analyzing administrative data. And there's, I think, you know, we're constantly kind of trying to bat away this idea that tech can just solve it. That's a pretty frustrating and very real threat to this work, because there's also very like enticing marketing pitches to go with that. And so we're trying to like keep that out. Not to say that all tech is bad, it's not, but there are certainly folks that maybe I would say don't have the, you know, like the holistic approach that you really want when thinking about these types of data. But the point of encouragement, similar to what Moin was saying about students, you know, I think that there are the folks that I get to interact with that are in agencies like Ben, like my previous colleagues in Colorado and many of the other places I get to work with, there is like a real appetite from people who have power to change things, who do the work in human service agencies to think differently and to challenge their own thinking about racial inequity within programs. And even for people that like a few years ago, that was not a common conversation, things have changed. Like there is a really like palpable shift in how people talk about this. And it's not just, you know, like I think Genevieve was saying before that, you know, like studying like race and ethnicity outside of white folks in ancestry and genomic studies is sort of niche. Like, I hope that that is changing in general across all of our fields, that like studying marginalized populations, studying people of color is not, you know, the niche you get one session at a conference group, that it's like sort of part of the playing field. And that also as part of that, we're decentering white people as the default.
Jen?
I don't know if I'm the best person to end on here, but I'll try to go. I think in terms of most discouraging is there's just a lack of incentives to change. I mean, I think that I come from maybe a different sort of field, and I'm in genetics and genomics, which is, you know, there is so much money poured into this field, both from the NIH as well as industry. And the incentive structure for research is not necessarily rooted on impact. It is rooted in careers. There's concentration of power and money and getting those papers. And so when the incentive structure rewards folks for doing whatever is going to be published in Nature or Science, which I know is, you know, somewhat hypocritical of me having just done this, but like, you know, there's no reason to change, and there's no reason for the focus to change away. There's not enough funding there that would adequately counter this. There's not enough prestige in these positions and these papers to counteract this. And I don't really see there being a sense of urgency around this either. You know, you bring up the real consequences that we currently have in medicine and public health in terms of genetics at these conferences. And what they do is they look at you and they tell you, oh, well, that's not great. And then they're not gonna publish your paper because you didn't have as big of a sample size, or you didn't have, you know, whatever they were looking for. And I think that's probably the most frustrating part of it. And it's difficult in a certain way. I mean, I am biracial, my husband is Hispanic, my kids are all mixed, all of our relatives are mixed, you know, and so that it's very frustrating doing work knowing that it's not going to help the people you love, and knowing that you're going to try to chip away at it year after year after year after year, but nobody cares about your people in a way. And I know this is not a unique feeling for any researcher, I think, especially in marginalized groups, but it is not discouraging, but it gets you angry. And I think that I pass as white in most circles, and I wanted to build off of what Dr. Tripp said, which is that I'm actually allowed to be a certain amount of angry, so I can move that. There are a lot of folks in this field who aren't allowed to be angry because they're discredited or not allowed to do the work, and I'm allowed to be a little bit angry in a way because of this sort of way that I'm positioned in, the way that I present, and then the way the field is right now. And so it's frustrating in general. Now, what's encouraging about this and what I'm hopeful about, I am the child of very stoic immigrants, and I'm from Massachusetts. So we're not very hopeful people. But what we are is that we're very spiteful and very angry people. And so we just keep on seeing that avenue for things. And I think that the thing that keeps me going, beyond the anger and the spite and everything, is that incremental progress of being allowed in the room. And that I think rooms are becoming slowly more perceptive of these things. And that there is a more openness to just to think of other people as people, which is, very shocking. But that's really it. I'm not going to say I have a lot of hope in terms of things like there's not a lot of evidence, and especially in these sort of like more, high money industry areas, places. Right now it's a fad to think about, diversity. I don't know if it's going to last. It hasn't before, so we'll see. Within genetics, I'm saying this all within the genetics field, but we'll see. And I'm resistant to say that my hope lies in students, because I think on one hand it's unfair, because students are completely reliant upon their PIs, completely reliant upon the systems. And if you want students to succeed, you need to establish systems which can allow them to succeed. And right now the incentive structure isn't there in genetics. And so I think in terms of the genetics and that field and the incentive structure, I don't see a lot of opportunity in that end for success just because of where the money is. But hopefully, things will change. But I don't know. Sorry to end it on a very, very down moment.
Well, we're not done. We're not done just yet, Jen. So don't worry about landing us there. We have a question.
So oddly, as soon as I stood up and got to the mic, you started talking about incentives, and that was exactly my question. I think I'm still going to ask it though, because I'd like to hear from others on the panel. So I would also like to have hope in the students coming up, but I worry because there's more and more pressure for them to publish in order to get grants and jobs. And so I worry a little bit about that. And I'm concerned about the rat race and how we're so committed to citation metrics, blah, blah, blah. With that being said, how do we change the incentives? You mentioned it's not getting funded. What else could we do? Personally, I talked about this with Moin earlier. I think departments need to change their documents of what they're requiring through tenure and promotion, and reward some of the things that we've talked about today. Anything else come to mind?
I think one of the things that really keeps the incentives the way that they are the disciplinary borders. And that as difficult as it is to publish interdisciplinary work, because of the way that it breaks ground, those places that make a home for it are more flexible than venues which are really rigid about disciplinary boundaries. So I think that one of the things that we really need to focus on to move that needle, to make it, and this is partly based on my experience. I did a doctorate in linguistics, and I'm currently in a speech language hearing science department, and I'm collaborating with developmental psychologists. And that's because speech language hearing science and developmental psychology have been more hospitable to my research than linguistics as with its the rigid disciplinary boundaries that it is typically associated with. And I appreciate what was said about it's not fair to say, oh, well, students are our hope. And I sort of wanted to further qualify like how I spoke about when I say that I feel like a bright spot, I feel some hope in the work that I'm doing to make it easier for other students, not because it's going to be great for them, and I don't like recommend my career path to people or anything, but because I just have this knowledge that I've made it easier than it was for me. And as small as that is, it's something for me to hold on to. So, yeah.
Others want to react to that?
I think that, so, you know, we've talked a little bit about academic incentives and funding for research and, you know, what drives people in the academic field, but I'll touch on government a little bit since I think about that a lot. And it really comes down to, I think at a big level, policy, which includes funding for different things. So like when requirements change for what you have to report on and be able to talk about and explain, there's a real tangible difference, assuming that you're also being held accountable to that and that there's funding included in that for agencies like Ben's agency or other state systems to carry out these, you know, new policies that are requiring better reporting on things like race and ethnicity and on better understanding inequities in programs. Another part of government work too is public scrutiny in politics. You know, like that is part of the incentive. Like when the national conversation changes, which it doesn't often, but like we have seen some shifts in it, in what people care about. Granted, now there's a lot of people that, you know, suddenly care about not having critical race theory in any part of school or public systems. But that's in response to a lot of people saying, no, we need this. This has to be part of how we think about public systems like education and human services. And those things, like, you know, governments have to pay attention to that in some way. And it is a thing that drives day-to-day decision-making of like, what is the press and the people talking about and what's bubbling up in popular culture. So a little bit different than academia, but those two things matter in terms of incentives at the government policy level. And maybe you agree or disagree with me, I'm not sure.
No, I pretty much
Yeah.
think great job. I will also just maybe add that like there's lots of policies, as I was saying, and the incentives push and pull in different directions, sometimes oppositional directions. So, you know, for example, I think this was a brief that was published where we looked at my colleague Dory Nicola. She and I looked at the effect of so when you get a cash grant, you know, some of your income is counted against that grant. So you get less if you have more income. That's a simple way of thinking of it. One source of income is, of course, is child support. Child support system, if you don't know, was like set up to sort of repay the state for welfare originally. That's another simplistic way to put it. But in Minnesota, we disregard a certain portion of child support. And this was sort of a interesting way of trying to give more money to households who are, you know, receiving child support. But the equity implications of it are pretty interesting because the households receiving child support tended to be white households. So this policy change actually benefited white households more than people of color in our caseload. And so that's an example of like kind of those competing incentives of different programs sort of like pushing and pulling against each other, I guess, sort of. But it just made me think about like the way government policies interact with each other can be extremely complicated. And, you know, one time you think you're doing something that's going to really help make a program more equitable, maybe make it a better program, can have off-counting effects on another side, especially when we're for programs that are for low-income people, because people tend to be in multiple things. They also might be experiencing, you know, more punitive sides of the state system or whatever. So I don't know. I think it's challenging you can think that things are all going in one direction, but they will actually push in other ways.
Any last thoughts from our panelists before I bring the discussion to a close? Jen? Anything?
No,
Moin?
no, that's great.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just not. I could.
Well, I want to thank everyone again for the entire day today. I think that for those who have had the opportunity to hear the talks and see these discussions, I think it has been a very rich set of reflections on data rigor and reproducibility in light of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to thank the College of Liberal Arts for the Interdisciplinary Collaborative Workshop Award, which made this possible through our project, The Many Faces of Reproducibility. I think the interdisciplinary part of that label is important because what we did today very much crossed disciplinary lines and gave us perspectives from very different domains. I also want to thank Amy and Chanda for working with me in organizing this, and thank everyone for taking the time to be with us today. We will process the video and make that available in the coming week or two. So for those who might have missed some of the presentations or some of the discussions, you will be able to go back and hear that. And with that, I bring us to a close and say thank you very much. And to everyone, have a good and safe weekend.